Lacy, the former police chief of Dalton, Illinois, is now facing the consequences of actions that federal prosecutors say were meant to deceive creditors and the court system. According to court records, Lacy devised a deliberate scheme to hide money while attempting to avoid paying a legally binding settlement from a past lawsuit. The core of the case centers on bankruptcy fraud, specifically the intentional concealment of assets while claiming financial hardship under federal bankruptcy law. Lacy's background as a law enforcement officer is central to the seriousness of the case. At the time of the alleged fraud, he was employed by the village of Dalton and held a position of public trust. As police chief, he was responsible for enforcing the law, yet prosecutors argue he knowingly violated it for personal financial benefit. His appointment came under former Mayor Tiffany Henyard, whose administration has itself been the subject of scrutiny. While her role is not part of the criminal charges, the political environment surrounding Lacy adds context to his rise and authority within the village. The financial issues began years earlier. In 2015, a civil lawsuit was filed against Lacy seeking damages totaling approximately $88,000. The dispute eventually resulted in a settlement agreement in February 2017, under which Lacy agreed to pay roughly $55,000. Settlement payments were expected to be made according to the terms approved by the court. However, court filings show that Lacy failed to pay a significant portion of the agreed amount, leading the plaintiff to file a motion to enforce the settlement. As pressure mounted from the court system, prosecutors say Lacy took steps not to resolve the debt, but to avoid it. By 2019, with a state court status hearing approaching, Lacy began preparing a strategy designed to shield money from creditors. Instead of resolving the outstanding balance, he filed for bankruptcy, a process intended to provide relief for individuals who are genuinely unable to pay their debts, not to protect assets through concealment. According to the factual basis of the guilty plea, Lacy had control and signature authority over multiple bank accounts. These included several accounts at Bank of America and multiple accounts held at J.P. Morgan Chase. Prosecutors allege that income earned by Lacy and his spouse was intentionally routed through accounts that were not disclosed during bankruptcy proceedings. Household expenses such as mortgage payments were reportedly paid from these accounts, demonstrating continued access to funds while claiming financial distress. The bankruptcy petition filed in August 2019 became the centerpiece of the fraud case. Federal authorities state that the filing was not made in good faith, but was instead part of a broader attempt to conceal money and mislead the court. Under federal law, bankruptcy filers are required to disclose all assets, accounts, and sources of income. Failure to do so constitutes bankruptcy fraud, a serious federal offense. The government's case argues that Lacy knowingly omitted relevant financial information in order to prevent creditors from accessing funds he legally owed. This deception was allegedly sustained over an extended period, covering the time frame when the settlement enforcement action was pending. Prosecutors describe the conduct as a calculated scheme rather than a misunderstanding or clerical error, emphasizing that the accounts were active, known to Lacy, and under his direct control. Lacy's role as a police chief further complicates the matter. As someone trained in legal procedures and sworn to uphold the law, prosecutors assert that he fully understood the obligations associated with bankruptcy filings. His position undermines any claim that the omissions were accidental. The court documents make clear that this was not a case involving financial confusion, but one involving deliberate concealment. The criminal investigation eventually led to federal charges, culminating in a superseding indictment that formally accused Lacy of devising and executing a scheme to defraud. The indictment outlines the core allegation, that Lacy filed a bankruptcy case for the purpose of concealing assets and avoiding payment of a settlement agreement that was already ordered by the court. This conduct, according to prosecutors, directly violates federal statutes governing bankruptcy and fraud. By the time the case reached resolution, the evidence collected by federal authorities left little room for dispute. Financial records, account histories, and transaction trails formed the basis of the government's argument. Facing these facts, Lacy ultimately chose to enter a guilty plea, acknowledging responsibility for the actions described in the indictment. That plea marked the point where the civil dispute officially transformed into a criminal conviction, setting the stage for sentencing and potential imprisonment. Lacy formally admitted guilt in federal court, putting an end to any remaining question about whether the bankruptcy filing was a mistake or a misunderstanding. By pleading guilty, Lacy acknowledged that he intentionally concealed assets for the purpose of avoiding payment to creditors, specifically relating to a court-approved settlement agreement. The plea makes clear that this was not a last-minute decision made out of fear of trial, but an admission that the crime occurred exactly as charged. According to the plea agreement, Lacy admitted that he filed the bankruptcy petition knowing it contained false and incomplete information. Federal prosecutors emphasized that the wording of the plea was deliberate, stating that Lacy was pleading guilty because he was, in fact, guilty of the offense. This language exists to prevent defendants from later claiming they accepted a plea only to avoid a harsher sentence. In this case, the court record establishes that Lacy accepted responsibility for his conduct without qualification. The factual statement accompanying the plea outlines how the scheme worked in practice. Lacy and his spouse continued earning income and depositing funds into bank accounts that were never disclosed during the bankruptcy proceedings. These were not dormant or forgotten accounts. Prosecutors showed that the accounts were actively used to pay household expenses, including mortgage payments, while creditors were led to believe there were no available assets. This contradiction is a central element of the fraud charge. The government further established that Lacy maintained control over multiple accounts at both Bank of America and J.P. Morgan Chase. Signature authority over these accounts confirmed that he had full access to the money at all times relevant to the case. The deliberate omission of these accounts from bankruptcy filings was described as a sustained effort to conceal funds, not a temporary lapse or paperwork oversight. Once the fraudulent nature of the bankruptcy filing was uncovered, the case moved swiftly toward resolution. Prosecutors presented financial records demonstrating inconsistencies between Lacy's declared financial status and his actual banking activity. These records formed the backbone of the government's evidence and directly contradicted claims of insolvency. Faced with this evidence, Lacy chose to plead guilty rather than proceed to trial. As part of the plea agreement, the government indicated it would recommend a prison sentence ranging between 24 and 30 months. This recommendation reflects the seriousness of bankruptcy fraud, especially when committed by a public official. The sentencing range does not account for additional penalties the court may impose, including supervised release and monetary fines. Following incarceration, Lacy will likely face conditions restricting his movement and financial activity. A sentencing hearing has been scheduled for March 9, 2026. At that hearing, the court will determine the final length of Lacy's prison term and any additional conditions attached to his release. The judge will consider the advisory sentencing guidelines, the facts admitted in the plea, and arguments from both the prosecution and defense. While the government's recommendation carries weight, the final decision rests solely with the court. The case has drawn attention largely because of Lacy's former position as a police chief. Federal courts place particular emphasis on accountability when public officials misuse their authority. Prosecutors argued that Lacy's conduct undermined public trust not only in financial systems but in law enforcement itself. His training and experience eliminated any plausible defense based on ignorance of the law. Though the plea resolves the criminal charges against Lacy, questions remain regarding the broader implications of the case. Court documents suggest that Lacy's spouse was aware of the financial arrangements, though no charges have been announced against her. Whether further legal action follows remains uncertain, but the existing conviction stands independently of any additional investigations. The outcome of the case reflects a clear pattern. Attempts to manipulate the bankruptcy system to escape lawful financial obligations carry serious criminal consequences. What began as a civil dispute over a settlement payment ultimately resulted in federal charges and a prison recommendation measured in years. The transition from respected law enforcement official to convicted felon underscores the court's position that no status or title places someone above the law. With sentencing pending, Lacy's future now rests in the hands of the federal court. Regardless of the specific sentence imposed, the conviction itself marks a permanent end to his law enforcement career. The case stands as a warning that financial deception, particularly by those entrusted with authority, is met with decisive legal consequences and lasting repercussions.